Hi everybody, welcome back to episode 6 of LaraChat Live. Got a couple of our usual cast here in Mike and Riz. A couple guys had to drop out, Matt and Adam and Dylan had to drop out last minute. I think it had to do with our guest Ken. They don't like him probably. Um, but to get started, you guys know Mike and Riz. So Ken is a new guy to our panel. He's a friend of mine and a business partner in our several ventures and ideas and whatnot. Ken is a fantastic logo designer and website designer. He has made some concepts for the new LaraChat logo and potential new site layout. Nothing to show yet that I want to share, but
Oh,
I am really
nothing
excited.
that I want to share.
Yeah. So as a thank you for Ken's help, I wanted to bring him on air and share some of his experiences with Google's accelerated mobile pages. And I think it was about 2 to 3 weeks ago, he did a bunch of work on AMP for his company, and I was getting a complaint from him every 5 minutes about this and that, and figured there's a lot of different things that developers need to know. So figured I'd bring Ken on board and give a kind of a primer or introduction to AMP and what we can do with it. So we will do that, and beyond that, some of our other topics we wanted to get into were CORS, cross-site forgery requests, and also HTML builders, which, as many of you know, Matt Lance, who's not here, he has an open source package called LaraCox, and in there there's a form builder. There's also several other form builders out there. So we talk a little bit about that, maybe badmouth Matt for not being here, and maybe badmouth his package, or maybe we do use it. I don't know. We'll find out what these guys think. But first and foremost, I'll let Ken take it away and give us some information about AMP and why most of us Laravel developers should probably know or care about this package or product.
All right, well, thanks, Sean. Thanks for having me on the show. So yeah, like Sean said, I'm the senior front-end developer for Metro Lyrics, which is a offshoot of CBS Interactive. And in regards to the topic at hand today with Google AMP, probably about a month and a half ago, it was known to us by corporate that Google was starting to enforce the Accelerated Mobile Pages project on websites and their mobile iterations. So it was kind of talked about within CBS Interactive on the various different web properties, and we kind of took the initiative to kind of pioneer that and implement it before some of the other properties did. So we rolled that out probably about 2-3 weeks ago, and since then CBS Sports, CBS News, and actually CNET just launched that this week. So I'm here to kind of give a little bit of a primer on kind of about what the Accelerated Mobile Pages project is, why it's important for mobile pages rendering, kind of where it's going in the future, and some of the good, the bad, and the massive headaches in implementing it into a legacy code base. So I'll preface this talk by saying that it's very front-end based. So if you have a really good handling of markup, CSS, Sass code, and stuff like that, this will be great. If not, it may be a good 10 minutes for you to grab a drink or do something else. So I'll kind of get started on basically the premise behind it. So the AMP project, basically, it's an open source project Google put out, and they've collaborated with a number of publishers online to provide web pages for mobile rendering that are quick loading, don't take a lot of third-party resources, and basically for the end user, improve the overall user experience. Um, so in terms of the end user, it's all about experience. In terms of the publisher, it's about fast rendering times and quick loading. And basically, what AMP pages are, they're a very stripped down mobile version of your website, of your web page, which is actually crawled and cached by Google, and the load times on them are near instant. So the major concerns in terms of front-end development is a lot of well, first off, JavaScript, third-party JavaScript is flat out prohibited in Google AMP pages. There's a number of design limitations in terms of what selectors in CSS can be used, what can't be used, there's restrictions on actual HTML tags as well, and the way that your HTML document is structured from your head tag down to your end closing. So I don't know exactly where we should start with this, but if there's any specific questions about like limitations or things to be mindful of, we can maybe start a roundtable on that. Sure.
Quick question. Can you kind of go into how AMP works? Is it more than just a validator? What's the technology stack? Does it? You mentioned it caches it to Google. Does Google then display its cache to the client, and the user doesn't even hit our site? How does that work?
From what I understand, and this is a little bit more of the back-end stuff that I'm not familiar with, from what I've been able to understand, though, is so you still have your mobile version of your website, which is you can directly navigate to on the web through your mobile device. You put a link rel inside your standard mobile document, and then when Google crawls your page, it gives them a reference that there's actually a valid AMP version of this page as well. Google then caches a version of that page, which stores it in its search results, and then when the user actually goes to a Google search and finds that page, Google actually serves that page rather than the original fully loaded page. So I believe there's a caching option that Google does offer for it. I don't know if that's native just by just referencing. So in your AMP page, you also reference like a canonical link as well to your original page. So from my understanding, that's kind of how it works. Basically, at a very high level way of saying.
So one question I wanted to ask, and I was scrolling back in our chat history, and I remember you complaining, well, I really shouldn't say the word complaining, but just being, I guess, a little frustrated with the file size limitations, and I think this was a JS file or a CSS file. Could you maybe tell me a bit about that and ways to improve that?
Yeah, so one of the things I found as I was going on, like if you're starting from scratch building mobile pages and keeping Google AMP in mind, it's fantastic. If you're jumping into a legacy code base, you're going to run into a lot of code blocks. So what you were referring to in terms of the CSS is the Google AMP JavaScript library actually has a built-in validator that you can run in your browser console, so you can see what's valid, what's not as you're developing. So it's really good at pointing out HTML and CSS errors, namely, like say if I'm using the use of the important designation within CSS, that's flat out prohibited within CSS. So it'll let me know every instance of that. Or if I'm using invalid HTML, like the image tag, for example, that's invalid HTML for Google AMP. We have to use a special AMP image tag for that. So just getting all of those items validated takes a long time. The validator is quite good at pointing out those errors, but then it's also not good at letting you know every type of error all at once. So once I got my markup and once I got my style code validated, then I found out, oh, there's also a file size limitation on the CSS that is called in the head tag. And that's another thing I also found out going along, was that your CSS has to be contained in a style tag within your document's head tag. So you can't even call it from a remote path or another path. So it's got to be within your head tag. So compiled, and then however many lines it is, that has to be under 50 kilobytes. And then working on Metro Lyrics, that was an issue because we have, like our code is compiled from partials upon partials upon partials in SAS, and then once that master file is compiled, I think it was something around 90 kilobytes or so, which is huge. So once that was compiled, I had to create a number of basically stripped down partials, call them separately within our SAS documents, strip out a whole bunch of unused CSS until our main CSS file was finally under about 50 kilobytes. So that's one of the main limitations there. Another limitation is no third-party JavaScript. You have to use everything from the main Google AMP JavaScript library, or you can use some of their own plug-in JavaScript, which is basically waitlisted for them. And I'm trying to think of some of the other major limitations. Oh, another major limitation was we have custom typography on our site as well. So we have our own font files that we've developed in-house, which is also prohibited for AMP valid pages. So we had to find a waitlisted alternative, which I believe the only two valid sources right now are Google Fonts, obviously, and I believe Fast Fonts is the other. So finding a valid font there was a bit of a challenge as well, to find something that most closely resembles. So we could create a version of our page that was as close to our original as possible.
Hey Ken, I got a quick question. Well, not really a question. I wanted to bring something up. So here's something weird. I talked to some local devs near where I live. I'm in Indonesia. And if you go to the AMP website and you go to the Who section, a good quarter of the sites there in Asia are from here. That kind of surprised me because it turns out a lot of people here know about it. I was like, how did it? It's like they're all major website, major news sites. And I was talking to some guys who've worked on this before, and they said that the real limitation going on here isn't really when it comes down to, well, it is partially the front-end guys. Like, they have to build the layout and all that. But there's a different mindset that the back-end devs need to factor in as well. And I know this isn't really your part of it, but it's become the most detrimental part of implementing AMP, from what I've heard. Because, for example, every image in an AMP image tag needs a set aspect ratio, I believe. Is it not a width and height, but an aspect ratio, right?
Yes, you have to have a set width and height. Fortunately, there is a responsive argument that you can add in there as well, so it will make it a fluid image, but you do have to enforce that aspect ratio from the outset.
Yeah. It's that kind of thing, because I was talking to some backend guys, and they said we had to spend a couple of weeks figuring out, for every news article, you would have to go to the backend, look up the file size, and then print that out, send it back to the front end. There's a little bit of extra going back and forth. And I understand why it does that. I understand it's to reduce the number of reflows, right? So it's to prevent the page from scrolling up or down or getting wider or smaller as the user is going down the page or as elements load. It all makes perfect sense. I just find that there's a lot of backend devs who think, is it really that bad to add a few more HTTP requests? Is it really that bad to have the page scroll up and down? Do you guys get that a lot?
It hasn't actually come up much here, but I definitely see your point. I think it probably hasn't come up a whole lot here just because of the nature of what we do. It's very music-based, so a lot of our imagery is based off of screen caps of videos and whatnot. So we do enforce a very strict aspect ratio when it comes to either album art or video caps and stuff like that. So it hasn't really been too much of a discussion point here, but I definitely see what you're talking about.
Interesting. Just curious, because I talked to some guys and they're like, "What's wrong with normal HTML?" I think it's great. I've been toying with it. It's just it does require a little bit of adjusting to get used to.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a learning curve. Like, it's definitely not difficult to work with. It's just once you validate for a certain case, then I just more errors come up, and then more errors, and just, oh, I thought I was done. Okay, not done quite yet. So, especially when you're dealing with a pretty large legacy code base for certain things. But one thing that I found has been really helpful is the plugins that they've developed for certain things, like our menuing system is actually done off of a lightbox that we did on a really hokey JavaScript plugin that we used, and implementing the AMP lightbox was almost like a dream, because I had it set up in about 5 to 10 minutes, and it's got your transitions, it's got animations, everything out of the box, and it just completely validates right away. So.
You mentioned in when you're developing, you can have a console command to kind of validate what you're working on.
Yes.
Does that also so I imagine when you're working on that, what you're looking at is what it's going to look like when the client sees it too? The browser will render it in the final version while you're working on it?
Yeah, so when I develop, I do my rendering in code, so I just do my user agent set to whatever device,
okay,
and then just go off my console for validation.
Cool. Then I had a couple more questions lined up here. Do you think this is going to move into the HTML5 spec in the future? Is this going to be a standard, or is this just going to be something that Google is putting the hammer down on?
I guess it's hard to say right now because it's in such its infancy. I'm kind of hoping that it does, because we've noticed so far that first off, our rendering times, just because we have a lot of third-party ad network agreements and stuff like that, so our mobile page loads are pretty horrific right now. And we've been noticing, because we've implemented AMP in 2 major areas of our site right now. The first one being our lyrics pages and our editorials pages, so our news items. And we've been noticing a real decrease in page load times since that's been implemented. So I'm kind of hoping that becomes more of a mobile standard. I do understand there's going to be a lot more design limitations, so I do see the design community having a bit of a pushback on that, just because there's a lot of stuff you can't use.
So you think we'll go back to the olden days of where you have a mobile version and a desktop version? Just because you might lose so much of the dynamic aspect of things and customization?
Yeah, I do see that. Our site right now is actually set up to detect by user agent, and it's not responsive. So I think it's probably a little bit easier for us to implement because we're not actually touching our desktop code base. Yeah, it really is hard to say. Until I start working with it in a responsive environment, I don't know how frustrating it could potentially be, but I do see some areas where it could potentially be an issue.
Last question on my part. Do you have any good resources you can point users to or viewers to kind of start learning about AMP, tutorials maybe, where to get started?
Sure. So the major site is ampproject.org. So that's Google's page that kind of gives you a bit of an outline, some examples. There's also most of my documentation that I got from the outset was on their GitHub resource, which I don't have the URL handy for that at the moment.
And we can probably look that up and put it in the show notes.
Sure, but that's where I got most of my information from getting started, was ampproject.org, and also their GitHub page, which outlines all of their plugins, all their front-end plugins, like AMP Lightbox, AMP Carousel.
Thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, thank you, Ken. I hope it was informative for people watching. I know I learned a lot of things from Ken when he was telling me about what he was doing, and I did want to make sure that I got him onto the chat and got to talk a bit about it, and so we can all learn more about it. Beyond that, we can move on to our next topic, which a little bit more developer backend focused, DevOps focused. So sorry, Ken, might be a fish out of water in this one, but if you do have any feedback on what we're talking about, please feel free to shout it out. So the next topic we wanted to step into was about cores. So as an example, Core can be set up as part of the app code. There's a Laravel developer, Barry Hoovel, I believe his name is, and he set up a Laravel package where someone can set up the core request on the app side. But there's also the DevOps question in regards to the DevOps can set up some server configuration to handle these settings. And as we all know, of course, can improve security. But I think one of the questions I have is, as an example, in one of the apps I was working on, I used Barry's package. And then as a developer, I also do some DevOps. I'm not a DevOps guru by any stretch of the imagination, but there are server configurations, and there is that Laravel package on the app side. So curious if you guys have any experience with Core. Do you prefer the app side, the DevOps side? What are your preferences? Which is more secure, actually? I imagine it's probably the same, but I'll open that to you guys and let me know what you guys think.
So let me ask you, in what situations would you resort to using cores?
This one,
Because I'm thinking anytime I would need an external access to my site, I would use an API.
Yeah, I was building an API, and I think they had the API was on api.domain.com or whatever, and then the app was www. Now, this might be a limitation on my knowledge, but I was having that in the browser was preventing me from making the request until I installed the package, Barry's package. So that's pretty much the extent of my knowledge. I'm looking to learn here too.
Mike, do you want me to go over a quick recap over what Cores is?
That'd be a good idea, yeah.
Yeah, so it's funny because Cores is one of those things you don't think about until you need it, and then you really hate it when you do. Cores exists because when you have a website, and it's talking to the browser in JavaScript, and it wants to talk to a different website, you can't just make a direct JavaScript request just to talk to their website, because you don't want a browser executing JavaScript as you, pretending to be you. Because then you could open any website, and your browser could pretend to be you with your session cookie, with all your other information, to another website. So it's a way of whitelisting a particular website that allows this. It's a way of letting the browser know, browser, this particular API is designed for access by another website. So as long as another website doing it, then yes, you may make a request on behalf of the user to my API. So it's not an issue for people who do APIs with people who do JavaScript requests, AJAX requests to the same website that the API is hosted on. So if you're opening Facebook.com and then you're doing a request to Facebook.com, then it's fine. You don't need Cores. This is when you're opening Facebook.com and you want to make a request to something-something-else.com. Normally, it wouldn't allow it. That something-something-else.com has to say, yes, you may make a request on the user's behalf. So the way it does that is it adds a header to the HTTP request when you do the second request. So you can say that, yes, I do whitelist this website for accessing us, for talking on behalf of users. And that's where the big question lies, right? Because it's basically just a whitelisting header. And there's a lot of arguing about whether or not you need to whitelist a specific website, or if you just do Cores accept all. I think it's a star. I don't know. I don't really remember a lot about Cores because it's one of those things I set once with the sysadmin and never think about again because it's a pain in the ass to work out. So Mike, how do you normally do it?
Well, I think I've used Cores only once and never again. Let's walk through this for a little bit. So I'm developing a front end that needs information from different data sources, right?
Right.
What if I were to have my front end, instead of going to Facebook and to GitHub at the same time, instead just go to Facebook and I create an API consumer in PHP that retrieves it from GitHub?
Yeah, you can do that.
And then I
It's
don't need
just a
cores,
single
right?
proxy. Yep, as long as you're talking to the same origin as the script. So yeah,
Right,
that works.
exactly. Yeah. And that's how I've always handled things so far, because I've kind of shied away from putting too much responsibility on the front end in JavaScript.
Mhm.
Especially with how easy Vue makes it, where you can, each page is like its little own module. And so I just have the page go back to my own server, and then I have API consumers that go out to wherever they need to go out.
That is actually a really valid option. The only issue with that is then you need to. It's great because you get to get a lot more control, right? You
Right.
don't just say you can. You don't. First of all, you don't have to manipulate the destination server because usually cores is a property of the destination server, not yours. So if you don't have control over that other server, then you don't need to touch it if you don't want to use cores. And also because it goes through your script, you don't need to be worried about, say, operations you don't really need to do.
Some
You can
kind of
whitelist
client
it.
issues where they get errors unexpectedly.
Right. So it's actually a good option. It's just more work, and you know how we developers are at work.
Control.
The things
So
that
let's
are
cover our
quick.
options.
Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to cover our options. So first, you could do what Mike does. So no course at all. Just make what we call a proxy script. Second, you could do it on the PHPN. It's basically like doing a header access control, allow origin. There are packages for it, so which we will link later on in chat and in the description. Or you can do it on the web server side, on Nginx or Apache side, where you just hard code it. There are arguments of whichever way you do it, and whichever way you do it, it actually still works the same because it's just an HTTP header. Go ahead,
The
Sean.
arguments probably rotate mostly around performance, which is faster. And if in my way, you'd have to make 2 or 3 requests rather than one straight request.
So one thing when I'm thinking about is a lot of people are starting to use the Vue.js framework, and one of the examples on there is calling the GitHub API. Do you think it's a correct assumption to make sure I understand, and some people out in the audience who may not know it much, when that Vue request makes that request, the HTTP request to the GitHub API, would you say that the GitHub API, their core headers is allow access for anyone? Do you figure that's how that's set up on their end?
Yes, it is. You can actually go to their developer.github.com/v3, and down there's a segment on course, which I'll post in the LaraChat chat, actually. Somebody can drop that on YouTube as well. So yes, it actually does do that. It does allow them. A lot of APIs do nowadays, especially the less sensitive APIs. I don't. Hang on. Yeah, I can't really screen share right now, but I will drop the link just for safety. But yes, basically GitHub and other open APIs like it do enable course requests. You can tell because there's access control allow origin star. And this is basically how you do it. Some people argue that you shouldn't just do star because that allows anybody to do it. Which is a kind of an issue because sometimes you don't want to allow every client to talk to you, only specific clients. So sometimes instead of doing a star, you want to read the domain from where the request is coming from, and then you want to put that into the header, which is sometimes the job for PHP. This is probably one of those aspects where we want to get as many devs on board as we can and just ask what they want. So maybe if you guys listening here have any ideas or thoughts about how to do course, or if you had issues getting course to work, because I'm very intimate with that, drop us a message on LaraChat's Slack channel, and we might talk about this again in the future. Oh yeah, Sean's got the page up there. There it is.
And I'm back. So thank you guys. I feel a bit smarter now. I definitely feel a bit more confident understanding how Chord works. Definitely hope it helps some people out there. Our third topic today was going to be about HTML builders. And when we first brought it up in our chat channel, our private chat channel, it was brought up by Matt Lance, who couldn't be here today. it got auto-corrected as hunk builders. So we were all asking ourselves, what's a hunk builder? And well, I think everybody had their own interpretation of that, and I think that went on for about a day, maybe two, before Matt realized his mistake and fixed it for us. And now we know he meant HTML builders. So as you might recall earlier in the show, I was talking about how Matt has the package LaraCogs, and there's a form builder option in there. And I believe Laravel 4 point whatever version, they also had a form builder option, which was consumed by the Laravel collective. Correct me if I'm wrong, guys. So personally, for me, I use Matt's LaraCogs package, and I actually don't use the form builder option. I prefer to use, your normal, I guess, natural HTML, inputting blade directives and variables where applicable. I do remember back in the days of Laravel 4 using the form builder that went into that the collective guys took over. I liked it, but and Ken will probably remember back in our days of our last job having to work on some PHP snippets, Laravel Blade PHP snippets instead of the HTML, standard HTML, and I bet it must have driven him insane. I'm curious of your thoughts on. Ken, I don't know if your mic's not on or what.
Sorry, my audio just cut out there for about 5 to 10 seconds or so. I missed about the last 2 or 3 words that you were talking about.
Oh, I was talking about form builders, and you might remember at our last job, we were in the views, we were using Blade, the Laravel templating library. Right. Instead of HTML, it was the Blade directive for form, the form open form, closed form. I can't remember the exact words, but you might remember a bit of that.
Yeah, I remember settling into it really quickly because there were a lot of similarities in HTML, so it's just a matter of understanding structure a little bit more. But in terms of actually working with it and implementing it, I didn't really find that much of an issue at all. But understanding the way snippets are called and stuff like that, yeah, that was kind of probably the most that I had to learn about it.
Which do you prefer, if you had the choice?
Well, knowing me, I'm a full front-end guy, so HTML is probably going to be my choice of preference. I can rapidly build and prototype in that. But then again, I don't tend to work in a hybrid style that way. So for my workflow, probably traditional HTML would be my preference, but I can see the pros and cons on either end of the table.
Awesome, thanks, Ken. Bringing back some memories of a few years ago. So, Red, you told me you had an interesting story and some history and drama about this. I'm actually really intrigued to hear this.
Okay, so this is the funny thing. HTML builders were in Laravel 4, right? They were originally a big deal because a lot of people would go to LaraCast and learn about Laravel, and oh, look at these really awesome builder methods that you can use in your form, so you don't have to think about how you write an input, hidden input. And people would start using the form builder and HTML builders heavily. Back then, the HTML builder was so far you don't even have to write an anchor tag. You can use a helper for the anchor tag, even though it's literally just open angle bracket A href. It's so short. People want to use the helper. And so when Laravel 5 rolled along, obviously I am not Taylor, but this is what I gathered from the IRC channel and on Slack. There has been a fear that new people are picking up form builders and HTML builders as gospel. Because they exist in Laravel, they should be used all the time. And so you'd find these hilarious websites where everything is a form builder. There's not a single line of HTML in the Blade template. It's all form builders or HTML builders, which gets a bit crazy. And then when they yanked it out of Laravel 5, a lot of people were like, hang on a second, I didn't know how Laravel did forms in Laravel 4. because forms, when you do a form open in Laravel, all it actually does is adds the, what's it called? The token. It adds this cross-site request forgery token hidden input. And it does a little bit other bits, a little bit more magic, but mostly it's just a normal form tag. So when the roll happened, a lot of people are like, I don't know how to write forms anymore. I didn't know I had to do this hidden input because we always use the form builder. And some people build alternative form builders, and that's why there's one in the Laravel Collective. That's why there's the LaraCogs thing. And there are many different ways in which you can do a form builder, and this is another part of the debate. So let me see if I can get a screen share going for just a minute. I should be able to just use Atom here, shouldn't I? Let's see if I can get this going. Okay, so yeah, so there are a few different ways. Is my screen share clear enough from you guys? So there are some different ways to do this. Some people prefer, so let's say you want to do a simple input tag with a class on it, right? So let's say you want a date picker. There's the old way of doing it with just a normal input. Some people do the blade directive model where you would do something like date picker, and then maybe you'd have a name here for the input. Some people would have a form helper, so a helper method. So it would look like maybe something like date picker input, something like this, and then here you could have the name, for example. Some people even like to use a facade, where you'd have a date picker input. This is using a Laravel facade. There are 100 different ways to do this, and everybody does it a little bit differently. So I've heard that Mike's built a form builder in the past, so take it along, Mike. How do you do it?
Yeah, so this started back in Laravel 4 when I loved the idea of the form builder, and I used it not because I didn't know how to do HTML, but because it saved me so much time of repetitive, tedious tags and stuff like that that were generic and didn't have to be unique to the design. So I expanded the form builder quite a bit and kind of built my own macros, added onto it. And then when it got dropped in 5, I'm like, hey, damn it, it's all gone now. I can't use it anymore. So what I did was I extended the Laravel Collective's form builder, which was just the one from 4 updated, and extended that with my own wrappers, basically. And so let me just demo that real quick. Let's see. And so what I wanted to achieve was, oh, I can't demo, darn it, won't let me share. What I wanted to achieve was getting something that's very concise to write, and where I can just plug in one line to take care of 10. For example, in when you have the bootstrap with the validation responses and the contextual validation and all that. So all that is included in my form builder, where I have, if you take a look at the register.blade file that comes in a normal Laravel project, it's about 70 lines long. After applying the form builder, I got it down to about, let me take a look here, register, I got it down to 22 lines, the entire file. And so this makes it a lot more visual. You can see more what's going on, and you don't have all this busyness with the helper classes or tags around everything. That's one aspect I like about it. And then, so Matt and I were talking last week about even taking this a step further and making a form builder class to where you build up your form in your controller, or even in the form request class. I was thinking of extending that to include a builder, and to where all you do then in your page is form output. But then I was thinking, the problem with that aspect is you don't know what the form looks like when you're looking at the code, so I decided not to do that, and I stuck with my blade directives. Mine works with both blade directives as well as the raw Laravel tags.
I would like to chat with you if you ever try to put it in a form request. That is a scary, scary thought.
I know, I don't want to do that because it takes so much away from what the blade template is supposed to be. You're supposed to be able to see what the page will look like. pretty much, in a Blade template. And if you just have form output, you're like, okay. Yeah.
So you consider it a good idea to move the commonly repeated aspects of your code into a helper class, basically.
Right. And yeah, it's not because of, well, it is a kind of laziness, but it's not because of not knowing how to do it right. It's because of saving time. And building up forms is something you do on every project. I want to make it go as quickly as possible.
Well, then the question moves on. If you're going to make common form elements in a helper class,
right,
what's stopping us from doing like common divs, a common block, or some other common front-end element? Or is that also the territory of HTML?
I was thinking of going down that road and having my form builder do every single HTML tag, you know, but I think it's helpful. I would only make a Blade directive if there is a Laravel function for it, not to replace HTML, but to make Laravel show up nicely in line with the HTML.
That's funny because I've in the past, there's this one time when I was auditing an old project, and there was this one time I was so glad that they used the HTML helpers. So here's what happened. They had a vulnerability in JavaScript, which meant that they had an added class to every anchor tag in their code base. Now imagine they did the anchor tags the old way, when they would do basically do string interpolation. So you'd have a regular old open bracket, a href, quotation mark, and then they do the Laravel blade thing in between. And thankfully they didn't do that. They used the helper. So we could simply extend the helper or go into the backend and look at the helper and add in the class element, the class attribute onto the helper. If that weren't there, we would have to go and do a massive regex that would have to accommodate for Laravel's braces and do a huge regex through the entire view structure, looking for every link in the website. So, after that happened, I used to be a staunch supporter of people doing things manually, and after that happened, I was like, maybe there is some merit to this because it looks useful. And this is one of those things that I think are really just a matter of taste. Because this is another argument that was brought up on Slack. People were like, when should you use a helper and when should you just use a simple partial? Because a partials also accept arguments. The only real difference is that partials don't accept logic because they're just views, right? Compared to a helper class which can have actual logic in them. And then there are even more debates, like, but if you're gonna have logic in the helper in the HTML builder class, isn't that also problematic? Because now you have logic in your views. Isn't that supposed to happen beforehand? Isn't that supposed to happen previously before the controller passes it on to the view? It's just such a personal topic. But yeah, it's a huge deal, and I think it's still an argument right now. Some people think it's great. Some people think it dehumanizes some of the community because they don't know how to actually write HTML anymore. I really wish we had Matt here.
My thought on not having logic in the Blade template is to keep it clean and readable, not because it's bad to have logic in there in itself, but you want to keep it clean and readable and have logic, have a single responsibility for everything. And so if you move logic into its own thing, then there's a single responsibility there. It's encapsulated. And in a way, you're doing that with the form builder. You're moving it out of the Blade view, and you're putting it in the form builder. So you're putting it in a dedicated place where it can be expected, not just random logic all over the place. Yeah, but yeah, definitely. It's arguments all on both sides, for sure.
So before I pass it back, go ahead, Sean.
Oh, so one of the things I was going to say, based on my experience with using different frameworks in the past, what I didn't like was having frameworks that felt like they were a little too heavily invested in what I was trying to do at the time. I preferred a lightweight framework where I can overwrite and extend what I needed, use what I needed, pass whatever I needed to the view, and so forth. And I really liked having that kind of power to do and use as I needed. So I used to use a framework called Yi, and one of the there were components in it where I could just plug in a component with a data set and it would automatically print out the table and a searchable paginated table and so forth. And that was really awesome for quick development as an example. But it made it hard in some ways because it would add its own classes, its own functionality, and that's why I've tended to prefer sticking with the standard HTML, CSS, whatever have you, and then just pass in whatever I need through into the Blade parameters, and using Jeffrey Wade Presenter GitHub project for any logic I needed to run, or even doing it in the controller before I go to the view.
And of course, that way too, you don't run into problems when you migrate to a different framework or an upgraded version that no longer supports that.
Definitely, it does make it more customizable, and I think it also makes it better for people like Ken to come along and fix where I break his HTML and CSS, which happens often.
That was one thing I noticed quite a bit when we were using Yi, is that it would put so many wrappers on elements that it would break and overwrite a lot of my HTML, because I would have nested divs within nested divs, and it would add an extra layer of wrapper onto my stuff, and I'd have to go in and clean up the mess. So inevitably, I'd probably go to Sean probably about 2 or 3 times a day. Now you broke my styles again. You broke my styles again. So having that raw code that I could just use my own styles and my own front end markup on, that's ideal in my end. So
I have one last question to toss to you guys. Well, particularly Sean and Mike, because I don't assume that you guys on the front end are going to do this, but I'm curious. Do you guys test your form builders, or do you consider them small and trivial enough to not test them?
When you say test my form builder, do you mean
Unit
if I
test.
use the form builder?
If you use the form builder, or if in any way, if you were to write your own helper, because I think we all agree that helper functions are okay. We probably don't agree on like full-fledged builders, but at least like a simple, there's this one element which I need 500 times in my code base. I'm not going to rewrite this 500 times. I'm just going to make a little helper for it. So maybe this is more for Mike, because he actually has this package. Is it unit tested? I'm just curious, because some people say, go ahead, Mike.
Oh no, I was going to say I'm in the process of writing tests for it, because the package isn't released yet.
I'm testing first.
What I would do in a project where I'm using it is write integration tests to test the front end, and probably rely on that as well as PHP unit tests when they're ready.
That makes sense. I'm just curious because I talked to some guys about this from the Symfony side, and they said probably the easiest indicator for when a helper is universally acceptable is if the logic is so simple that you don't need to test it. That is probably okay, because that means it's simple enough that it doesn't need its own class and testers and stuff. But okay, it's good to know. Let me know when you release it.
So one of the things I do for my testing is I don't always have the time to write a Selenium script, for example. So I'm just going to screen share this site. I like this site a lot, Ghost Inspector. I can use the browser plugin, and it will go through and create my tests for me. I run them. It will tell me pass or fail. There's a video. There's also it does an image analysis from the previous test to see if there's maybe there's a div out of alignment or the copy's changed, and I can visually and quickly see what has happened. I like this one a lot, and I think it's good to mention when we're talking about form builders, because that's more of a front end. Well, it is back end and front end, but it has front end components that we do want to make sure that they are, whether you're using form builder or HTML, that they are working properly. So I think that basically kind of wraps up our topics for today. I'd like to start looking into the community and passing it over for the Q&A. And one of the questions that we got, and I think I want to defer this one to Ken first and foremost, because he is a designer and he has that awesome pink wall behind him.
Which has actually been burning out my eyes over the course of the past hour.
Someone asked, when will Seafoam Green be back in fashion?
Seafoam green? I'm waiting for the comeback of acid green. Take it back to 97.
There we go. So one of the questions that a serious-ish question, how big of a team is too big for you guys? I think that's a good question because we've worked with different size teams over the year, and I think it really depends on the project, of course. But maybe what makes you feel that a team is way too big, too many developers, too many chiefs? I'm curious about that.
I think it depends on the dynamic of the team rather than the size of the team. I've worked in small teams and large teams, and sometimes the large teams were really good because the leadership was good, and you had so many avenues to learn from your not elders, but more advanced senior developers. And in a small team, the smaller team gets, the more you lose that. So a small team might be more cohesive, but if the management isn't there, then the small team won't help you any either. And I mean, the smaller it gets, if you're down to one person in your team as a freelancer, the harder you have to work to get find mentors and get outside influence, which is really important to me as a developer.
I think it's actually kind of important at that point whether or not you decide if the manager of the team is actually a developer. I think that's a huge aspect here.
Absolutely.
That is because if you are in a company where the manager is not a developer, it's very easy for no matter how big or how small the team is, it just collapses. That's from my experience.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to mention, yeah, definitely I agree with you there. Having a manager with development experience it helps the project immensely. But one of the big things that over the years of my experience is communication is like the absolute key. There have been so many projects I've worked on, people I've worked with, and through my own fault, through them, where we just didn't communicate. There were answers I needed from them. They didn't know how to give them to me. And people have also needed answers from me, and I had no idea that they were looking for it, and they weren't asking me for it. But I think definitely having a strong communication, the ability to communicate is huge. And as I mentioned earlier, Ken and I have worked on many different companies together and worked on several different side projects and hackathons and whatnot. And he and I, close as we are as friends, we still have that communication breakdown at times where sometimes I have no clue what he's doing, and it's trying to pull nails out of wood to get the information from him. But then at the same time, there's times that he's been working, and I'm sure he has a lot of horror stories about me, where he has no clue what I'm trying to convey or do, and it really just does not, it makes the project fail. So as an example, because Ken and I work together on side projects, every Sunday we have a development potpourri where we try and get up at 10 a.m. and have a little chat about what we're doing, what we're wanting to do during the week, maybe talk about the LaraChat logos and so forth. And I find that actually really helps because it stimulates the conversation, it stimulates what we're doing. I really find that communication is key. Always be talking to your managers, your developers, know what they're doing, know what you're doing.
Yeah, like between Sean and I, we kind of treat our weekly talks as more of like an extended stand-up, kind of like what we're on, what the status of certain things on, what our priorities are at, and kind of how we're going to piecemeal things out in the week going forward. Kind of going back onto the question of what about the team dynamic, I think it also comes down to the resources that are necessary for the scope of a project too. Like we have a very small team in my office here, and it works great. Our communication is spot on, and we're very, very productive. But we do feel that there is a need that we have to grow in order to achieve some of the objectives that we have. Now, finding the right cultural fit in that is a big key to make sure that it fits the dynamic that we have as a team. But we also understand the limitations that we just don't have the manpower to tackle what we want to tackle. And we know we have to get bigger, but we also want to be mindful of having that same culture.
I think that's basically where, funny enough, I feel that some patterns like microservices or building on smaller APIs or splitting off a project actually comes into play. Because when you realize your team is too big, that is a great time to decide, okay, you three, you guys, you focus on this feature. It's not, you guys go work at some other office halfway across the world, don't talk to us anymore, we'll meet you in summer. But at least you can separate the team a little bit, because I think the real issue with two big teams is the noise, right? And those stand-ups. And you have 20 people talking across the room to each other. So splitting up the team actually works out really, really well. I just want to use my my amazing powers to read minds, because I think Matt Lance just dropped us a message, and he said that, in his opinion, teams over 5 are too many. And I think that's about my sweet spot. Around 5 or 6 by default. Unless it's a team I know very well, who I can talk to casually, and I can talk to, communicate. There's certain people, who you can talk to easily, and you don't need to spend an hour explaining a feature. They just get it, right? And I think that takes time. You can be like that with anyone. You just need to be able to communicate properly and make your point and explain a problem secondly. It's not that hard, but it does take time. So I think it's also why maturity of the team matters so much. Sean, you want to show something?
Yeah, so I would actually going to share the screen here. So this book here, I just got this book yesterday and I started reading it. And mind you, I'm still reading through it, but I think it is an excellent book for software developers who want to take that next step into the management side of this world. And even when I was reading through it in the initial chapters, one of the things that really struck to me that there was some advice in there that would have been amazing when I was a full-fledged software developer, not even focused on the management side of things, that helped me understand where my manager is coming from, what makes a good manager, what makes a bad manager, and also what onus is on myself as a developer to communicate with my manager or my superiors, whether they're a senior developer or whatnot, to again communicate. If they don't know what you're doing, well, they definitely don't know. But I just wanted to share that book and encourage anybody to check it out. I'm still reading through it, and I found it incredibly helpful. So we have one more question. We're kind of going over the time limit here, but the question was, what do you do to get people past the overwhelming feeling that their code had to be as elegant as the core code of Laravel, which is a difficult bar to hit when you don't have experience? I think that's an excellent question. I know that I've said before, I build at Laravel has propelled me as a developer to be more conscientious of the PSR standards, calling myself, feeling as if I am an artisan, that my code follows the solid principles, single chain of responsibility, all that stuff, unit testing, etc. There's a lot more than just writing spaghetti code, and Laravel is what kicked me into that realm of being better. With regard to someone who's new, I don't actually know what the best experience is, because my first thought is to take the time to learn how to code properly. Learn what the solid principles are, learn what the single chain of responsibility is, learn some design patterns, and force yourself to be better as opposed to just writing the code. And I think in the long run you will be better for that.
So here's a little bit of story about this first. Lackbox is an old friend of mine. Well, not old friend in real life, but we know each other for a long time because we would spend a lot of time on Laravel's IRC channel helping out newbies. And so if you want war stories, ask him. He spends even more time than I do answering people on Laravel IRC. And it's funny because Laravel IRC channel is actually a bit, I don't want to say lower level, but because IRC is easier to enter than Slack, inevitably people have a tendency to be more of a novice in IRC. So he answers these people a lot. People who's open LaraCast for the first time and says, "Oh my God, there are these principles in PHP. I'm not doing any of them. Panic! I need to refactor all my code right now." And he goes through all these best practices and principles and patterns and, "Oh my God, my code is ugly. Refactor ahoy! I should never write another line of code until I figure out how all of this works." And that's his question. Like, what do you do about this? Because we all know it's bad for newcomers. Because then they spend a week trying to refactor a 20-line controller when to use a repository controller, method controller, message bus, event handler, CQRS thing. I don't even know what half of those are. And so a lot of people get stuck in that rut. They spend too long figuring things out. And instead of actually writing code, they try to write out the structure. How do you guys explain it to your novices or newbies who ask you out?
So I think I'm still going through that process. I don't think that process stops, because I've been doing Laravel now on a daily basis for 2 years, and at the start I was exactly like that. I'm like, okay, all I knew was classic PHP from when it was PHP 4, and then I took a couple years off, came back to Laravel, and greatest thing since sliced bread, but I'm not as good as the code. So I guess what I did, first of all, I dove headfirst into Jeffrey Way's LaraCasts, soaked up as much as I could, kept up to date with it, and applied what I knew how to apply. And those things that I didn't know how to apply, I didn't worry about too much. I kept them in my mind, but I coded how I knew best. And the next project around, I got smarter and said, hey, I could have done it this way because I learned a little more. And I think that's what you have to do. You have to iterate on yourself. And because if you get stuck in that coder's block where you don't want to code because it's not good enough, you're not going to learn. But on the other hand, if you don't care about the code and just go ahead and code it, and you think you're going to refactor it later, you're not going to learn either because you're not doing something better than you were yesterday. Does it kind of make sense? Huh?
I think it does. Ken, before we wrap up here, do you want to add anything to this question? You need to turn off your mic.
Sorry about that. I can't really think of anything where this actually applies to me in my day-to-day, so I don't know exactly what I can contribute. But yeah, definitely a good listen on my end.
So what we'll do now is we'll wrap up the show. I want to thank Ken for giving his talk about Google AMP project, and of course Mike and Riz for their very, very insightful thoughts. So we will be back in 2 weeks, and hope to see you guys there. Anybody have any further questions, we'll be on the chat channel or the Slack chat channel and Twitter. You can reach out to us there. Please feel free to suggest topics if there's things you want us to talk about. And also, we're more than welcome to have future guests. If you have an interesting topic to talk about, come on or let us know and let's talk about it. And I think one of the things we should be talking about in the next episode is probably Laravel Spark. It's all the rage right now. We would be doing it a disservice if we didn't talk about it. But that being said, thank you all, and bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
See ya.